Felix, a weary firefighter, was heading home after a long, exhausting shift when something caught his eye on the side of the road. A tiny, helpless puppy, drenched and shivering in the storm. Without a second thought, he rescues it, bringing it home and giving it warmth and care. But as the days go by, something starts to feel off. There's something strange about the way this puppy acts. And then, one fateful night, the shocking truth is revealed. Felix realizes the puppy he's been raising isn't a dog at all. It's something else entirely. What happens next will leave you on the edge of your seat. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. No more waiting. The story begins right now. Felix's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he navigated through the storm. 24 hours of back-to-back emergency calls had left him bone-tired, and the rhythmic swish of his wipers was nearly hypnotic. Rain pelted his windshield like bullets, making the dark road ahead a blur of shadows and reflections. "Almost home," he muttered to himself, leaning forward slightly as he took the familiar bend on Highway 16. The empty stretch of road usually meant he could relax a bit, but tonight the weather demanded his full attention. His headlights swept across the wet asphalt, and suddenly something caught his eye. A small, dark shape on the shoulder of the road. Felix squinted, his firefighter's instincts overriding his exhaustion. He eased his foot onto the brake, carefully pulling onto the shoulder. For a moment, he sat there, rain drumming on the roof of his truck. He should just drive on. He was tired, was probably nothing, just a piece of debris from the storm. But 15 years of rescue work had taught him to trust his gut. Grabbing his flashlight from the glove compartment, Felix stepped out into the downpour. The rain immediately soaked through his shirt, but he barely noticed as he approached the mysterious shape. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and his heart clenched. There, curled up in a pitiful ball, was a puppy. Its fur was plastered to its tiny body, and it looked more like a drowned rat than a dog. As Felix crouched down, the pup lifted its head slightly and let out the weakest whimper he'd ever heard. "Hey there, little one," Felix said softly, already shrugging out of his jacket. "Let's get you somewhere warm." He wrapped the jacket around the trembling creature. Cradling it against his chest, the puppy didn't resist, probably too weak to try. Back in his truck, Felix cranked up the heat. He could feel the puppy's rapid heartbeat against his palm as he held it close with one hand and steered with the other. "You're going to be okay," he murmured, glancing down at the bundle in his lap. "We'll get you checked out first thing tomorrow morning. The vet opens at 8. I know because my buddy Matt's always complaining about their early morning rush." At home, Felix carried the puppy straight to his bathroom. He grabbed his softest towel and began gently drying the tiny creature. Under all that wet fur was a skinny little body that made his throat tight. The pup's eyes were barely open, but Felix could see they were a warm brown color. Working quickly but carefully, Felix arranged some old blankets near the heater in his living room, creating a cozy nest. He placed the puppy in the middle, watching as it immediately curled into a tight ball, still shivering slightly despite being dry. Felix sank onto his couch, unable to take his eyes off the small form. Where had it come from? Was there a worried family out there searching in this storm? He'd check for missing pet notices tomorrow, but for now, his eyes grew heavy as exhaustion finally caught up with him. Just as he was drifting off, he heard it, a tiny chirping sound from the puppy's makeshift bed, almost like a bird's call. The first hints of dawn were hours away when Felix stirred to unfamiliar sounds. His neck ached from sleeping awkwardly on the couch, and for a moment he couldn't remember why he wasn't in his bed. Then he heard it again, tiny scratching noises and the rustle of movement from near the heater. The storm had passed, leaving behind a peaceful quiet, broken only by water dripping steadily from his gutters. Felix sat up, rubbing his eyes, and looked toward the makeshift bed he'd created. The puppy was awake, its small body moving in strange fluid motions that reminded him more of a stretching cat than a dog. "Hey there," he whispered, not wanting to startle the little creature. Moving slowly, Felix went to his kitchen and returned with a small bowl of water and some torn-up pieces of turkey from his fridge. He set them down near the puppy's blanket nest. The pup's nose twitched at the food, but after a tentative sniff, it turned its head away. Felix frowned, worry creeping in. He'd dealt with plenty of rescued animals before. His sister was always bringing home strays, but never one so young and fragile. "You need something in your system, buddy," he murmured. Dipping his finger in the water, he carefully brought it to the puppy's mouth. This time, the response was immediate. The tiny creature began eagerly lapping at his fingertip, its pink tongue darting out for every drop. As Felix repeated the process, he found himself caught in the puppy's gaze. Its eyes were huge and dark, seeming almost too aware for such a young animal. There was something about the way it looked at him that made him pause, something he couldn't quite explain. Different, not quite, right? Sleep was impossible now. Felix grabbed his phone and settled back on the couch, the puppy watching his every move. He pulled up his browser and began searching, caring for abandoned puppy. What to feed very young puppy? Signs of puppy dehydration? Page after page offered advice, some helpful, some contradictory. The soft scratch of movement caught his attention again. The puppy was getting to its feet, somewhat unsteady but stronger than before. Its legs seemed unusually long and delicate as it stretched. And then a high-pitched chirp filled the room. Felix frowned, lowering his phone. That sound, it wasn't any kind of bark he'd ever heard. It was more like a bird call than anything that should come from a dog. The next morning, the sun painted golden stripes across Felix's living room floor. He stretched his stiff muscles, hearing the soft click of tiny claws on hardwood. The puppy he'd rescued last night was already up and moving, its nose twitching as it investigated every corner of the room. Though still unsteady, it showed more life than it had during the storm, taking careful steps and pausing to sniff everything in its path. Felix watched, amused, as the little creature discovered a dropped pen cap and pounced on it with surprising agility. "Feeling better, huh?" he said softly. In his kitchen, Felix cracked eggs into a pan, making enough for himself and a small portion for his tiny guest. The sizzle of breakfast cooking drew the puppy's attention immediately. Its pointed ears, oddly large for its size, swiveled toward the sound. When Felix set down a small plate of scrambled eggs on the floor, the puppy approached cautiously. It sniffed the offering, then did something peculiar. Instead of eating the eggs where they sat, it grabbed tiny mouthfuls and tried carrying them away, searching for hiding spots behind the trash can and under the kitchen cabinets. "That's different," Felix muttered, watching the strange behavior with growing curiosity. After breakfast, the puppy continued its exploration of the house, moving from room to room with increasing confidence. Felix noticed it completely ignored the plush dog bed he'd arranged near the heater. Instead, it found a spot under the couch, curling into a tight ball with its bushy tail wrapped around its body. From this hideout, it watched Felix's movements with bright, intelligent eyes. Looking at the pup's reddish-brown coat catching the morning light, Felix suddenly knew what to call it. "Shadow," he said quietly, testing the name. The puppy's large ears twitched at his voice, but otherwise it remained still, observing him from its hiding place. Felix grabbed his keys and wallet, leaving Shadow safely confined in the living room, while he made a quick trip to the local pet store. He loaded up on essentials, puppy food, chew toys, a small blue collar, and a lightweight leash. The cashier cooed over the photos he showed her, though she remarked that she'd never seen a puppy quite like that before. Back home, Felix sat cross-legged on the floor, holding out one of his purchases, a soft blue ball with a squeaker inside. Shadow emerged from under the couch, approaching with cautious interest. Instead of chasing the ball when Felix rolled it, Shadow pounced on it, shaking it forcefully from side to side, as if trying to break its neck. Then, to Felix's amusement, the pup carefully pushed and nudged the ball until it disappeared under the couch with the rest of its growing collection of treasures. Felix couldn't help but laugh. "You are one weird dog," he said affectionately, watching as Shadow's tail disappeared back under the couch. The midday sun blazed overhead as Felix guided Shadow toward his truck. The small creature, already showing more energy than the night before, squirmed in his arms like a living slinky. Felix placed him carefully on the passenger seat, but Shadow immediately began exploring, his nimble body moving with surprising grace as he investigated every inch of space. "Hold still, little guy," Felix said, attempting to wrap a blanket around the restless pup. Shadow dodged his hands, climbing over the center console with remarkable agility. You're a wild one, aren't you? At the veterinary clinic, the waiting room smelled of antiseptic and pet shampoo. Dr. Miller, a woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, greeted them warmly. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun as she led them into the examination room. "Let's have a look at this little fellow," she said, lifting Shadow onto the metal table. Her experienced hands moved carefully over his small frame, checking his teeth, eyes, and limbs. "These teeth are quite sharp," she noted, "and his legs are unusually long for what appears to be a German Shepherd mix." She glanced at Felix. "How's his behavior? Any barking?" Felix shook his head. "Actually, he makes these weird chirping sounds, and he doesn't eat normally. He keeps hiding his food all over the house. Prefers to stay hidden under furniture, too." Dr. Miller's eyebrow arched with interest. As she finished the examination, Shadow suddenly twisted free from Felix's grip. With impressive speed, he scrambled onto the counter, navigating around medical supplies with cat-like precision. "Oh my!" Dr. Miller caught him gently, a mix of surprise and amusement on her face. "He's certainly unique." She carefully returned him to the examination table. "Overall, he's healthy, though if you're curious about his breed, we could do some genetic testing." Felix shrugged, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "He's just a mutt. Doesn't matter what he is." The drive home felt lighter, with Felix relieved about Shadow's clean bill of health. Back in the living room, he watched as his peculiar new companion made himself at home. Shadow bounded across the floor and in one fluid motion scaled the back of the couch. He perched there like a cat, perfectly balanced on the narrow surface. Felix couldn't help but laugh. "You're a strange one, Shadow, but you're mine now." Shadow responded with a high-pitched chirp, his bright eyes fixed intently on Felix's face, seeming to understand every word. That night he went to bed hearing Shadow's chirping. The morning sun painted golden stripes across Felix's living room floor as he blinked awake. His neck felt stiff from sleeping in an awkward position, but as he glanced at Shadow, who was watching him intently from his perch on the kitchen counter. The thought of leaving his unusual new companion alone for 24 hours made his stomach twist. "What do you think, buddy? Want to come to work with me?" Shadow tilted his head, those bright eyes fixed on Felix's face. After a moment's hesitation, Felix grabbed the new blanket he'd bought for Shadow and headed to his truck, the little creature trotting close behind. At the firehouse, Felix's arrival with Shadow caused quite a stir. His colleagues gathered around, their faces a mix of curiosity and amusement as they studied the small creature. "That's supposed to be a puppy?" Matt, Felix's best friend, crossed his arms and grinned. "Looks more like something that belongs in the woods, man. You sure you didn't rescue a baby coyote or something?" Felix rolled his eyes. "He's just different." Throughout the day, Shadow proved to be quite the explorer. He slipped silently through the station, appearing in unexpected places. The crew would find him curled up in their turnout gear or tucked away in half-open lockers. His movements were so... Shadow stared at him intently, those bright eyes focused and alert, but made no move to obey. "Come on, buddy, sit." Shadow tilted his head, then suddenly darted around the room, weaving between the furniture legs with playful energy. After several failed attempts at stay and come, Felix dropped onto the couch with a frustrated sigh, rubbing his eyes. A moment later, he felt a slight weight beside him. Shadow had jumped up and curled into a tight ball, pressing against Felix's leg. He let out a soft, gentle chirp, almost as if trying to comfort him. A week slipped by, and Felix found himself studying Shadow more closely each day. The changes were subtle at first. The way his coat seemed to deepen in color, taking on a richer, more vibrant reddish hue. His puppy awkwardness was fading, replaced by a lean, graceful build that made his movements appear almost liquid smooth. "You're getting bigger, buddy," Felix murmured one morning, running his hand along Shadow's back. The fur felt different too, thicker, with an unusual texture he couldn't quite place. Shadow's legs had stretched out, becoming more slender and agile. When he moved across the room, it wasn't with the bouncing gait of a puppy, but with something more calculated, more predatory. Felix tried to brush these observations aside. All puppies go through weird growth phases, he told himself, but the doubts lingered in the back of his mind. At the fire station during a quiet afternoon shift, Felix sat at the break room computer, scrolling through pages of dog breed information. He clicked through photos of German Shepherds, Huskies, and various mixed breeds, searching for any combination that might explain Shadow's unique features. Let's see. Night activity, independent nature, chirping vocalizations, he muttered, typing keywords into the search bar. Nothing seemed to match. No breed description could account for Shadow's peculiar habits. The way he cached his food, his complete disinterest in other dogs, or those distinctive sounds he made. Matt wandered into the break room, coffee mug in hand. He peered over Felix's shoulder at the screen full of dog breed photos. Still trying to figure out what kind of mutt you've got there? Matt chuckled, taking a sip of his coffee. Maybe he's a fox in disguise. Felix laughed, but something about Matt's casual joke struck a chord. After Matt left, Felix hesitated for a moment before typing "fox behavior" into the search bar. His heart beat a little faster as he began reading. The articles described behaviors that felt eerily familiar. Nocturnal activity, food caching, chirping vocalizations called geckering, solitary nature, aversion to other canines. With each new detail, Felix felt his certainty about Shadow's identity beginning to crack. That night, needing to clear his head, Felix clipped on Shadow's leash for a late walk. The streets were quiet, illuminated only by the steady glow of street lamps. Shadow padded along beside him, but there was nothing puppy-like about his movements now. Each step was calculated, silent. As they approached the park, Shadow suddenly tensed. He pulled at the leash, urging Felix toward the darkness beyond the lit path. Felix tightened his grip, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. Shadow stopped and turned to look at him. In the artificial light, his eyes caught and reflected the glow in an unsettling way. Then he opened his mouth and let out a chirp, a sound that seemed to hang in the still night air. Wild and haunting, and completely undog-like. Felix sat at his kitchen table, coffee mug warming his hands as he stared at his laptop screen. Browser tabs filled the top of the window. Red fox behavior, fox's pets, fox vocalizations. Shadow lay curled up on the nearby windowsill, his tail wrapped tightly around his body in a way that looked distinctly undog-like. The morning light caught Shadow's fur, highlighting the rich auburn tones that had developed over the past weeks. Felix scrolled through another article, his coffee growing cold as he read about fox behaviors that matched Shadow's quirks with unsettling accuracy. Later that day, Felix found himself back at Dr. Miller's veterinary clinic. The familiar antiseptic smell filled the examination room as he shifted nervously from foot to foot. I know this might sound crazy, Felix began watching as Dr. Miller gently examined Shadow. But is there any chance he could be part fox? Dr. Miller chuckled at first, but her smile faded as she looked more closely at Shadow. She ran her hands along his elongated legs and studied his sharp facial features. You know, she said thoughtfully, his proportions are quite unusual for a dog. The way he moves, it's more like a predator than a typical pet. She straightened up, adjusting her glasses. We could do a DNA test if you'd like to know for sure. Felix's stomach tightened at the suggestion. Did he really want confirmation? The possibility that had seemed absurd just days ago now felt frighteningly real. That evening, Felix sat on his back porch, watching Shadow more carefully than ever before. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance, and Shadow's ears immediately swiveled toward the sound, his body tensing in response. When leaves rustled in the garden, he dropped into a crouch that looked nothing like a playful puppy's stance. Felix pulled out his phone and found himself navigating to an online pet supply store. His finger hovered over the add to cart button beneath a DNA testing kit. Taking a deep breath, he pressed it, telling himself it was just for peace of mind. But as he watched Shadow's sleek form prowling along the porch railing, he knew in his heart that he was only confirming what he already suspected. The living room was quiet except for the gentle ticking of the wall clock and the occasional pop of settling wood. Felix dozed on his worn leather couch, one arm draped over his eyes, while Shadow lay curled in a tight ball at his feet. The peaceful scene seemed perfect until it wasn't. Shadow's head snapped up suddenly, his entire body going rigid, his ears swiveled forward like radar dishes, and his eyes fixed on something beyond the window that Felix couldn't see. Before Felix could even sit up properly, Shadow had launched himself across the room in a flash of reddish fur. "Shadow!" Felix called, his voice thick with sleep. But Shadow was already at the window, his nose pressed against the small gap where Felix had left it cracked for fresh air. Then, in a movement that seemed impossible for his size, Shadow squeezed through the narrow opening and vanished into the darkness. "No!" Felix stumbled to his feet, nearly tripping over the coffee table in his rush to the door. He grabbed his flashlight from the kitchen counter and burst outside, his heart hammering against his ribs. The night air was cool against his face as he swept the beam of light across his yard. "Shadow," his voice echoed through the quiet neighborhood streets. "Come here, boy." But the only response was the rustle of leaves in the light breeze. Felix searched frantically, checking behind bushes, under porches, and in every shadow he could find. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but there was no sign of Shadow's distinctive red coat or bright eyes. As the hours crept by, Felix's voice grew hoarse from calling, and his legs ached from walking the neighborhood streets. Finally, as midnight turned to early morning, exhaustion won out. Felix trudged back home, his shoulders heavy with defeat. The house felt emptier than it ever had before, and sleep seemed impossible. He left the back porch light on and collapsed into his armchair, staring at the door with red-rimmed eyes. Just before dawn, when the sky was beginning to lighten from black to deep blue, Felix heard it, a soft scratching at the back door. His heart leaped as he rushed to open it. There stood Shadow, his fur slightly damp with morning dew, his bright eyes fixed on Felix's face. There was something different in that gaze now, something mysterious and unknowable. He patted inside silently, leaving tiny wet paw prints on the floor. Felix let out a shaky breath of relief as he closed the door behind them. Shadow had come back. Hours later, Felix sat at his desk, staring at the unread email in his inbox. The subject line was simple: DNA test results, sample number 2847. His cursor hovered over it, trembling slightly as his hand refused to click. Shadow lay nearby, sprawled across the floor in a patch of sunlight, his red coat gleaming. Taking a deep breath, Felix finally clicked. The page loaded, revealing charts and percentages that confirmed what his heart had already known. Shadow was 100% Volps, a red fox, not a dog, not even part dog, a pure wild fox. Felix pushed back from his desk, running his hands through his hair. The room felt suddenly too small, too confined. He glanced at Shadow, who yawned and stretched, completely oblivious to the weight of this moment. "A fox," Felix whispered. "You're actually a fox." The words felt strange in his mouth, like speaking a foreign language. He turned back to his computer, fingers flying across the keyboard as he searched for information about fox ownership. Each new tab brought worse news. Article after article confirmed his fears. Keeping a fox as a pet was strictly illegal in his state. The penalties were severe: heavy fines, possible jail time, and most importantly, immediate confiscation of the animal. His throat tightened as he read about previous cases. Wildlife authorities taking illegal exotic pets from homes, animals being relocated to sanctuaries, or worse, euthanized if they were too domesticated to survive in the wild. The sound of soft padding drew his attention. Shadow had moved to his usual spot by the couch, curling into a tight ball with his tail wrapped around himself. His eyes brightened alert despite his relaxed posture. Watched Felix with that familiar intensity. Felix's chest ached. Everything made sense now, the chirping instead of barking. The way Shadow moved more like a cat than a dog, his aversion to other canines, his nocturnal activity. All those little quirks that had seemed odd but endearing were actually natural fox behaviors. He'd been so blind. Or maybe he'd just seen what he wanted to see. A puppy that needed saving, not a wild animal that needed... What? To be left alone? To grow up in the forest with its own kind? Shadow chirped softly, a sound that Felix now recognized as a typical fox vocalization. It was the same sound he'd heard that first night in the rain, the sound that had made him think he was rescuing an injured puppy. Felix slumped in his chair, the reality of the situation crushing down on him. He couldn't keep Shadow, not legally anyway, if anyone reported him. If any authority figure realized what Shadow really was, they would take him away. The thought of losing him, of watching someone carry him off, made Felix's stomach turn. He watched as Shadow dozed, peaceful and trusting, completely unaware that his whole world might be about to change. For the first time since that rainy night when he'd found that small, shivering creature on the roadside, Felix wondered if he might have to say goodbye. The next day, Felix sat in Dr. Miller's office, the printed DNA results clutched in his hand. The paper was crumpled from how tightly he'd been holding it during the drive over. Shadow sat in his carrier, watching them both with alert eyes. "I had my suspicions, Doctor," Miller said softly, adjusting her glasses as she studied the results. The signs were there, his behavior, his physical characteristics. "But I didn't want to worry you without proof. What can I do?" Felix's voice came out rougher than he intended. Dr. Miller's expression softened with sympathy. "Legally, there's not much you can do. Keeping a fox as a pet is prohibited in this state. I'm required by law to report this." Felix's heart sank. He has nowhere else to go. "There are wildlife sanctuaries," she suggested gently, "places equipped to handle foxes. I can make some calls." "He's not just some wild animal," Felix interrupted, his hands clenching. "He's family." Dr. Miller nodded understandingly. "I know this is hard. Let me give you the number of someone who might help, a wildlife rehabilitator I work with." Later that afternoon, Felix sat across from Natalia Chen, a veteran wildlife rehabilitator. Her office walls were covered with photos of rescued animals. She listened intently as Felix explained Shadow's situation, occasionally nodding. "The problem," Natalia explained, leaning forward in her chair, "is that Shadow was rescued too young. He's completely imprinted on humans, on you specifically. He never learned how to be a wild fox." "So he could learn, right? In a sanctuary?" Sarah's expression grew serious. "It's not that simple. Adult foxes who are this domesticated rarely adjust well to sanctuary life. They don't know how to interact with their own species. They become stressed, depressed. Some never adapt at all." Felix felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. "So what's the alternative?" "There isn't a good one," Natalia admitted. "He can't legally stay with you, but he's not equipped for life in the wild or even in a sanctuary. He's caught between two worlds." The drive home was silent. Felix's mind raced with possibilities, each one seeming worse than the last. That evening, he sat on his couch watching Shadow sleep in his favorite spot beneath the window. The fox's chest rose and fell peacefully, completely unaware of the impossible choice Felix faced. Shadow's ear twitched in his sleep, and he made a soft chirping sound, the same sound that had first captured Felix's heart on that rainy night. The thought of never hearing that sound again made Felix's chest ache. He knew his time with Shadow was running out. Soon he'd have to make a decision that would change both their lives forever. But for now, he just watched his friend sleep, trying to memorize every detail of this moment, slowly falling asleep. The next day, Felix hunched over his phone during his break at the firehouse, scrolling through endless pages of exotic pet regulations. His coffee sat untouched beside him, long since gone cold. Every few minutes, he'd run his hand through his hair, a habit that showed his growing frustration. The laws were clear and strict. No foxes as pets, period. But there had to be a way around this. He couldn't lose Shadow, not after everything they'd been through. He dialed another number, this time reaching out to a wildlife sanctuary in the next state. The conversation followed the same pattern as all the others. "I understand your attachment," the sanctuary director said kindly, "but foxes aren't meant to be pets. We have excellent facilities here." Felix ended the call before she could finish. He'd already contacted 6 different agencies that morning, 3 legal consultants and 2 rehabilitation centers. The answer was always the same. Shadow needed to go. Matt walked into the break room, catching the tail end of Felix's last call. He pulled up a chair, spinning it around to sit backwards, arms crossed over the backrest. "You look like you're about ready to throw that phone through a wall," Matt said. Felix let out a heavy sigh. "I've tried everything. Nobody wants to help me keep him." Matt was quiet for a moment, thinking. "What about special permits? I knew this guy once who kept a rescued hawk. couldn't be released back to the wild, so they gave him permission to keep it for educational purposes. Felix's head snapped up, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time that day. Special permits? Yeah, for non-releasable animals, if you can prove Shadow can't survive in the wild. Felix was already pulling up his photo gallery, scrolling through videos of Shadow's peculiar behavior, trying to sleep in the dryer, stealing socks, chirping at the television. He had dozens of clips showing just how domesticated Shadow had become. "Matt, you're a genius," Felix said, already drafting an email to Dr. Miller, requesting a formal statement about Shadow's domestication level. He spent the next hour gathering evidence, videos of Shadow's failed attempts to hunt even the slowest moving insects, photos showing how he avoided other animals, preferring human company. He even started collecting statements from his fellow firefighters about Shadow's behavior at the station. That evening, Felix sat on his living room floor, watching Shadow stalk a moth that had gotten into the house. The fox's movements were graceful, predatory, a reminder of his wild heritage. But when the moth escaped through an open window, Shadow simply trotted back to Felix, curling up against his leg with a contented chirp. Felix reached down to scratch behind Shadow's ears, feeling the soft fur beneath his fingers. Shadow belonged here, with him. Now he just had to convince the authorities of that fact. The morning air was crisp as Felix led Shadow along their usual route. The fox trotted beside him, his red coat gleaming in the early sunlight. Something felt different today, a tension Felix couldn't quite place. Mrs. Chen from next door stood watering her flowers, her usual friendly wave absent, as she stared at Shadow with narrowed eyes. Felix quickened his pace, tugging gently on Shadow's leash. A jogger slowed as he passed them, doing a double take. "What kind of dog is that?" he asked, brows furrowed. Felix's heart skipped a beat. "Oh, just a mix," he mumbled, already turning toward home. At the firehouse later that morning, Matt pulled Felix aside near the equipment lockers. His usually cheerful face was serious. "People are talking, man," Matt said in a low voice. "About Shadow. Thompson's wife apparently looked up fox breeds after seeing him last week. And John, you know, the new guy, he made this crack about calling animal control." Felix's stomach dropped. He gripped the edge of his locker, knuckles white. If someone reported Shadow before he could get the special permit, they'd take him right away, Felix said, more to himself than Matt. "No questions asked." Matt nodded grimly. "Maybe lay low for a while." That evening, Felix paced his living room, watching Shadow at the window. The fox stood with his front paws on the windowsill, ears perked forward, nose twitching at the evening air. Felix made his decision. "No more walks," he said firmly. "No more station visits. Not until this permit comes through." Shadow seemed to sense the change immediately. He moved from window to window, chirping softly, his usual playful demeanor replaced by restless energy. He scratched at the door, looking back at Felix with questioning eyes. Felix's heart ached as he watched his friend's confusion. This wasn't fair to either of them, but he couldn't risk losing Shadow. Not now. As night fell, Felix double-checked all the windows and doors. Shadow paced behind him, still agitated, still hoping to go outside. "Just for now, buddy," Felix said softly, turning the deadbolt with a final click, heading to bed. Few days later, the wildlife sanctuary stretched out before Felix's truck, a vast expanse of natural habitat dotted with enclosures. The gravel crunched under his tires as he pulled into the parking lot, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He'd left Shadow at home, unable to bear the thought of bringing him here. Not yet. The morning air was cool and crisp, carrying the sounds of various animals. Felix followed the signs to the main office, where Rachel Green waited to meet him. She was tall and weathered, with kind eyes that had seen countless animals come and go. "Welcome to Wild Haven," she said, extending her hand. "I understand you have questions about fox rehabilitation." Felix nodded, following her as she led him down a winding path. She explained their process, how they assessed each animal, determined their ability to return to the wild, and cared for those who couldn't. "Some foxes are too imprinted on humans," Rachel explained, gesturing to a distant enclosure. "They stay here permanently, where we can ensure their safety and proper care." They approached the fox enclosure, a large fenced area with natural features, logs, brush piles, and small dens. Felix's heart sank as he watched the residents. They darted away at the sight of humans, disappearing into the undergrowth, or watching warily from a distance. None showed the slightest interest in human interaction. "These are true wild foxes," Rachel said softly. "This is their natural behavior." Felix thought of Shadow, how he curled up on the couch, how he chirped for attention, how he followed Felix from room to room, how different he was from these suspicious wild creatures. "We provide excellent care," Rachel continued, her voice gentle but firm. "They have space, proper nutrition, veterinary care." "But no family," Felix interrupted, his voice rough. Rachel turned to him, her expression sympathetic but resolute. "He's a fox, Felix. No matter how much you love him, you can't change what he is." The drive home felt endless. Felix's grip on the steering wheel never loosened, his mind replaying images of those skittish foxes. He could picture Shadow there, confused and alone, wondering why his family had abandoned him. His heart screamed against the very thought, even as his mind acknowledged the reality of their situation. The house was silent except for the gentle hum of the heater. Felix sat in his armchair, watching Shadow's sleeping form. The little fox was curled into a perfect circle, his tail wrapped snugly around his body, his chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. A sudden scratching sound broke the quiet. Felix blinked, focusing on Shadow, who was now awake and pawing at the back door. His movements were urgent, desperate. He let out a series of sharp chirps, his claws scraping against the wood. "Shadow, buddy, what's wrong?" Felix stood, approaching slowly. The fox's agitation grew. He paced back and forth, his chirps turning to high-pitched yips. His eyes darted between Felix and the door, filled with an unfamiliar wildness. Gone was the playful companion who curled up on the couch. In his place stood a creature torn between two worlds. Felix's chest tightened as he watched Shadow's internal struggle play out. The fox's movements became more frantic, his body language speaking of an urgent need to answer some distant call that Felix couldn't hear. After a moment's hesitation, Felix reached for the door handle. "Okay," he whispered, more to himself than to Shadow. "Okay." The door swung open to the cool night air. Shadow froze in the doorway, his whole body tense. For several heartbeats, he didn't move. Then, like a shot, he bolted into the darkness. Felix's heart leaped into his throat. He grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and rushed after Shadow, his feet pounding against the damp grass. The beam of light swept across the yard until it caught a flash of red fur at the tree line. There sat Shadow, perfectly still, staring into the shadowy woods. His ears were perked forward, his posture alert and wild. In that moment, he looked exactly like the foxes at the sanctuary. A creature of the forest, not a pet in a home. The realization hit Felix like a physical blow. Had he been selfish? Had his love for Shadow blinded him to what was best for the fox? Shadow turned his head, meeting Felix's gaze. Time seemed to stretch as they looked at each other, neither moving. Then slowly, deliberately, Shadow stood and walked back to Felix's side. Felix released a shaky breath, relief flooding through him. Tonight at least, Shadow had chosen him. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Felix poured his coffee with trembling hands. His mind kept replaying the events of last night. Shadow's desperate dash to the woods, that moment of uncertainty, and his eventual return. Now Shadow sat motionless by the back door, his nose nearly touching the glass as he stared into the yard, as if still weighing his decision. Felix took a sip of coffee, wincing at its bitterness. He hadn't slept much, and his eyes felt heavy. A sharp knock at the door made him jump, coffee sloshing over the rim of his mug. When he opened the door, his heart sank. A uniformed wildlife officer stood on his porch, clipboard in hand. The man's badge read, "Officer James Holloway." "Good morning, sir. I'm Officer Holloway from the Wildlife Protection Division. We received a report about an illegal exotic pet at this address." Felix's mouth went dry. What kind of report?" "Several neighbors have mentioned seeing what appears to be a fox being kept as a pet." Holloway's eyes scanned past Felix into the house. "How long have you had the animal?" Felix's mind raced. "About 2 months. I found him as a baby during that big storm in April." "And do you have proper licensing for keeping a wild animal?" "I'm working on getting permits," Felix said, trying to keep his voice steady. "He's completely tame, officer. He wouldn't survive in the wild." Holloway's expression remained neutral as he made notes on his clipboard. "Mr. Carter, keeping a wild fox is illegal in this state, regardless of how tame it may seem. This is your official warning." He tore off a yellow slip of paper. "We'll conduct a follow-up visit in 2 weeks. If you don't have proper permits by then, we'll have no choice but to confiscate the animal." Felix took the paper with numb fingers. "Please, he's not dangerous. He's like family." "That's exactly the problem, sir. Foxes aren't meant to be family pets." Holloway's voice softened slightly. "I understand you care for the animal, but there are laws in place for good reasons." Felix watched helplessly as Holloway returned to his vehicle and drove away. He closed the door slowly, then pressed his forehead against the cool wood. The warning notice crumpled in his fist. Time was running out. Felix hunched over his desk, the blue light from his computer screen casting shadows across his tired face. His fingers flew across the keyboard, adding the final touches to his special permit petition. Beside him, a stack of papers held everything he'd gathered. Veterinary records showing Shadow's unique behavioral patterns, testimonials from the firehouse crew, and Dr. Miller's professional assessment of Shadow's domestication. He glanced at Shadow, who was perched on the windowsill, watching a bird outside. The sight made Felix's chest tighten. Everything about Shadow's posture screamed fox, from his alert ears to his bushy tail. But the way he turned to chirp softly at Felix showed something else, a bond that couldn't be measured in scientific terms. The next morning, Felix arrived at the Wildlife Protection Office, his thick folder of documents tucked under his arm. The receptionist directed him to Dr. Evelyn Mark's office, where a stern-faced woman sat behind a desk covered in conservation pamphlets and wildlife photographs. "Mr. Carter," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her, "I've reviewed your initial application." Her tone was professional but cool. "You understand that what you're asking for is highly unusual." Felix nodded, opening his folder. "I know it's not ideal, but Shadow's situation is unique. I've brought everything to show why." Dr. Adams held up a hand. "Foxes belong in the wild, Felix, not in someone's house. It sets a dangerous precedent if we start making exceptions." "Please," Felix said, pulling out Dr. Miller's assessment. "Just look at his case. He was found during a storm, raised from when he was tiny. He's completely imprinted on humans. He doesn't even know how to hunt properly." He showed her videos on his phone. Shadow trying to bury kibble in the couch cushions, sleeping curled up next to Felix's pillow, chirping for attention when Felix worked late. "He failed every wild animal assessment test," Felix continued. "He doesn't know how to interact with other foxes. A sanctuary would be cruel. He'd be isolated, confused. He needs stability, routine. He needs..." Felix's voice caught. "He needs his home." Dr. Adams studied the documents, her expression softening slightly as she watched the videos. She picked up Dr. Miller's detailed behavioral analysis, reading it carefully. "I've seen many cases of well-meaning people trying to keep wild animals as pets," she said finally. "It rarely ends well for either party." "I know," Felix admitted, "but this isn't about keeping a wild animal as a pet. This is about doing what's best for Shadow. He chose to stay with me even when he had the chance to leave." Dr. Adams tapped her pen against the desk, considering. "I'll review your application thoroughly before making my final decision," she said. "That's the best I can offer right now." Felix left the office with his heart a little lighter. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. For the first time since the wildlife officer's visit, he felt a small flicker of hope. The station alarm blared through the quiet night, jolting Felix from his thoughts. "Structure fire at Henderson Industrial Park," the dispatcher's voice crackled. Multiple buildings involved. Within minutes, Felix and his crew were racing through darkened streets, the truck's sirens piercing the night. As they approached, an orange glow lit up the sky. The warehouse was already fully engulfed, flames licking at the metal roof. "We've got to contain this before it spreads," Captain Harris shouted over the roar of the fire. "Carter, Martinez, take the east entrance." Felix adjusted his mask and gripped the hose line, but his mind flickered to Shadow, alone at home. He'd left in such a hurry, barely having time to make sure the doors were secure. The image of Shadow's questioning chirp as he'd rushed out haunted him. Focus, he told himself. The job needed his full attention. Inside the warehouse, thick smoke reduced visibility to almost nothing. Felix and Martinez worked their way through, checking for victims while battling back the flames. The heat was intense, even through their protective gear. A loud crack echoed above them. "Structure's compromising," someone yelled through the radio. Before Felix could react, there was a deafening crash. Part of the ceiling came down between him and Martinez, cutting off their exit. Smoke poured through the new opening, choking the air. "Martinez!" Felix called out, his heart hammering. The radio crackled with static. The temperature was rising rapidly. Felix could feel the sweat running down his face inside his mask. His breathing quickened as the reality of their situation set in. They were trapped. "Hold on," voices called from outside. "We're coming through." Seconds stretched like hours as Felix heard his team working to clear a path. His thoughts drifted to Shadow again. His bright eyes, his playful chirps, the way he'd curl up against Felix's side during thunderstorms. The permit application sat unfinished on his desk at home. What if Dash? Suddenly, hands grabbed his shoulders, pulling him toward a newly cleared opening. "Got you?" Matt's voice came through clear. "Come on!" They emerged into the cool night air. Felix yanked off his mask, gulping in fresh oxygen as the medical team rushed over. Martinez was already being checked out nearby, giving a shaky thumbs up. As soon as the paramedics cleared him, Felix jumped into his truck. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as he sped home, his turnout gear still reeking of smoke. He burst through his front door, still coughing. "Shadow?" There was a familiar chirp and Shadow appeared from behind the couch, his red fur glowing in the dim light. He approached Felix cautiously, nose twitching at the smell of smoke. Then as Felix sank to his knees in relief, Shadow pressed his cool nose against Felix's cheek, letting out a soft, concerned chirp. Few days later, a plain white envelope sat on Felix's kitchen counter, the wildlife department's official seal stark against the paper. Felix stared at it, his coffee going cold beside him, his hands gripping the mug too tightly. Shadow watched from his perch on the windowsill, head tilted as if sensing the weight of the moment, his bushy tail wrapping around his paws. With trembling fingers, Felix picked up the envelope. Everything hinged on what was inside. His future was Shadow, the little fox who'd become family in ways he never expected. He drew in a deep breath and tore it open, the sound of ripping paper unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. His eyes scanned the first paragraph, heart thundering in his chest. Then he saw it. Approved. The words seemed to leap off the page, bold and clear against the crisp white paper. Felix had to read it 3 times before it sank in, his vision blurring slightly. The letter outlined the conditions, strict requirements about Shadow's care. He would need a proper outdoor enclosure with specific dimensions and security features, including double-entry gates and dig-proof fencing. Regular veterinary checkups were mandatory, along with detailed record-keeping of Shadow's diet and behavior. Public outings as a pet were forbidden, but none of that mattered. Shadow could stay. Felix slumped in his chair, relief washing over him in waves that left him feeling weak and giddy. Shadow chirped softly, jumping down to investigate his human's unusual behavior, his cold nose nudging Felix's hand. The phone rang, startling them both. It was Dr. Adams, the wildlife veterinarian who'd helped champion their case. "I wanted to call personally," she said, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. "Your case was unique, Felix. The dedication you showed, the evidence you gathered, it made a difference. Not many people would fight this hard for a fox." The board was impressed. Felix's throat felt tight with emotion. "Thank you," he managed, watching as Shadow investigated the fallen envelope. "He's lucky to have you," she added. "Make sure you follow those guidelines carefully. We'll be checking in periodically." That evening, Felix sat on his back porch, watching Shadow explore the newly constructed outdoor space. The enclosure was spacious, built to specifications with climbing platforms, natural features, and plenty of hiding spots that satisfied both Shadow's wild instincts and the department's requirements. Shadow darted around, investigating every corner, his red fur catching the last rays of sunlight as he bounded from platform to platform with graceful agility. After thoroughly exploring his new domain, Shadow trotted back to where Felix sat. He pressed against Felix's side, letting out a contented chirp that seemed to say he approved of the arrangements. Above them, stars began appearing in the darkening sky, twinkling like promises kept. For the first time in weeks, Felix felt the knot in his chest finally loosen. They were home. They were safe. They were together, exactly where they both belonged. A month after receiving the permit, Felix stood in his backyard, admiring the transformation. What had once been a simple lawn was now a carefully designed sanctuary for Shadow. The enclosure stretched across half the yard, its sturdy fencing rising 10 feet high. Inside, natural-looking platforms created different levels for climbing, while carefully constructed tunnels wound through artificial hills. Shaded dens dotted the space, offering cool retreats during hot days. Felix had spent weekends building it all, following the wildlife department's specifications down to the last detail. The double-entry gate system ensured Shadow couldn't slip out when Felix brought in food or fresh water. Underground fencing prevented any escape attempts through digging, though Shadow had shown little interest in leaving. The adjustment period brought its own challenges. Despite having this elaborate outdoor space, Shadow still preferred the comfort of indoor living. Most nights, he'd pad into the house through his special door, seeking out his favorite spots. Curled up at Felix's feet or sprawled across the back of the couch. Sometimes, Felix would wake in the middle of the night to find Shadow perched on the windowsill, his eyes reflecting the moonlight as he watched over his human companion. At the firehouse, Felix's colleagues continued their good-natured teasing about his unusual pet. During one shift, Matt approached with a mischievous grin, holding up a tiny piece of fabric. "Check it out," Matt said, displaying what looked like a miniature version of their turnout gear. "I figured since he's basically the station mascot now." Felix chuckled, shaking his head. "He's not a fire dog, Matt. He's just Shadow." Yeah, Matt replied, tucking away the vest. "Still the weirdest-looking dog I've ever seen." But despite the jokes, everyone could see the positive changes in Shadow. He seemed more energetic, more playful, as if having the freedom to express his wild side had awakened something in him. The fox would spend hours exploring his enclosure, diving through tunnels and leaping between platforms with impressive agility. What amazed Felix most was Shadow's choice to stay. The enclosure's height wasn't impossible for a determined fox to scale, yet Shadow showed no interest in escape. Instead, he developed a routine, exploring his outdoor space during the day, then returning to Felix's side as evening approached. One peaceful evening, Felix sat in a chair near the enclosure, tossing a small rubber ball inside. Shadow watched it bounce, his head tilted curiously. Instead of chasing it like a dog would, he pounced on it with fox-like precision, trapping it between his front paws. Rolling onto his back, Shadow batted at the ball playfully, letting out cheerful chirps that made Felix laugh. "Yeah, you're definitely not a dog," Felix said, watching his unusual companion with affection. The night was unusually still when Felix jerked awake, his heart skipping a beat at an unfamiliar sound. Through the open window came Shadow's distinctive chirps, but they were different somehow, more urgent, more wild. Felix threw off his blanket and rushed to the back door, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor. Stepping onto the back porch, Felix's eyes adjusted to the darkness. The moon cast long shadows across the yard, and there, near the far corner of Shadow's enclosure, he saw what had caused the commotion. Two sleek figures stood just beyond the fence, their red fur barely visible in the dim light. Wild foxes. Felix's breath caught in his throat. The visitors were beautiful and untamed, their muscles tense and ready to flee at any moment. Their eyes glowed in the darkness as they fixed their gaze on Shadow, who stood alert in his enclosure, his own body language a mirror of theirs. Time seemed to freeze as Felix watched the silent exchange. These weren't just any foxes, they were what Shadow was meant to be, free, wild, unfettered by human constraints. The thought made Felix's chest tighten with an unexpected ache. Shadow took a tentative step toward the fence, his movements careful and deliberate. The wild foxes shifted their weight but held their ground, waiting. Felix's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment he'd been dreading since the day he discovered what Shadow really was. The moment when the call of the wild might prove stronger than their bond. Another step. Shadow's nose twitched as he caught their scent. Felix wanted to call out, to beg him to stay, but he knew he couldn't. This had to be Shadow's choice. The wild foxes stood perfectly still, their presence offering Shadow a glimpse of a different life, a life of freedom, of hunting under the stars, of following ancient instincts that still stirred in his blood. But then Shadow stopped. His ears flicked back and forth, catching some sound that only he could hear. Slowly, he turned his head toward Felix, tilting it in that peculiar way he always did when making up his mind about something. The moment stretched out, heavy with possibility. To Felix's amazement and relief, Shadow began backing away from the fence. His movements were unhurried but deliberate as he created distance between himself and the wild foxes. With graceful steps, he padded across his enclosure and made his way to Felix's side. The wild foxes watched for a moment longer before melting into the shadows like spirits, leaving no trace of their visit except the racing of Felix's heart. Shadow pressed his face against Felix's leg in a familiar gesture of affection, then hopped up onto the porch as if nothing unusual had happened. His message was clear. "I'm home." The next day, the call crackled over the radio at the firehouse, cutting through the quiet evening. An elderly man, Robert Wilson, had wandered away from his home near the forest edge. Felix's stomach tightened as he listened to the details. 78 years old, early signs of dementia. Last seen 3 hours ago. "Gear up," Captain Martinez called out. "Search and rescue operation." As Felix climbed into the truck beside Matt, his mind drifted to Shadow. Just that morning, he'd watched his fox alert to a rabbit in the backyard, long before it had become visible, tracking its movements with those keen senses of his. The forest was dense and dark as teams spread out with flashlights. Felix and Matt took the eastern section, calling out Mr. Wilson's name as they swept their lights across the underbrush. "You okay?" Matt asked, noticing Felix's distraction. "You seem somewhere else." "Just thinking," Felix replied, pushing through a thicket. "About Shadow, actually, the way he tracks things, how he's always so aware of everything around him." Matt raised an eyebrow. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Felix paused, the idea taking shape. "Maybe there's a way Shadow could help with searches like this. His senses are incredible, better than any dog I've seen." Later that night, after they'd found Mr. Wilson huddled under a fallen tree, Felix took Shadow to the woods behind his house. The fox moved with purpose, his nose working constantly, ears swiveling to catch every sound. Felix watched in amazement as Shadow tracked a night creature through the underbrush, never losing its trail. The next few days were a blur of research and phone calls. Felix reached out to Dr. Adams, explaining his idea about training Shadow for search and rescue work. To his surprise, she didn't dismiss it outright. "There's been some experimental work with domesticated foxes in Europe," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Their sense of smell is remarkable, and they can navigate difficult terrain better than dogs in some cases. It would need to be carefully controlled, of course." They met to discuss the possibilities. Dr. Adams brought documentation about similar programs, explaining how Shadow's natural abilities could be channeled into something meaningful. That evening, Felix sat with Shadow in the backyard, scratching behind his ears. The fox leaned into his touch, chirping softly. "You saved me once, buddy," Felix murmured, thinking back to those dark days before finding Shadow. "Maybe now we can help save others." Shadow responded by pressing his nose against Felix's hand, chirping again as if in agreement. The autumn evening painted the sky in shades of amber and gold as Felix sat on his back porch, marking exactly 1 year since that stormy night when he'd found Shadow. The air held a crisp chill, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Shadow dozed beside him, his red fur catching the last rays of sunlight. He'd grown into his wild beauty, no longer the trembling kit Felix had mistaken for a puppy. His coat was thick and luxurious, his movements graceful and sure. The special permit tag hung from his collar, glinting in the fading light, a reminder of their hard-won right to be together. Felix smiled, remembering their journey. The DNA test that had changed everything, the fight to keep Shadow, and finally their unexpected path into search and rescue work. Just last week, Shadow had helped locate a lost hiker, tracking the scent through difficult terrain where even the police dogs had struggled. The firehouse had become Shadow's second home. Even Max, the station's Dalmatian, had learned to accept the unusual presence of a fox among them. The crew now kept special treats in the break room, though Shadow still preferred to steal them when no one was looking. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, Felix reflected on how much his life had changed. Before Shadow, his days had been consumed by work, his house empty and quiet. Now there was always movement, always life, whether it was Shadow's playful chirps or his silent, watchful presence. The fox stirred beside him, stretching his lean body before settling closer to Felix's side. His outdoor enclosure stood nearby, a testament to their compromise between wild and tame. But Shadow rarely used it for more than play, preferring to sleep indoors, curled up on his favorite spot on the couch or at the foot of Felix's bed. The first stars began to appear as darkness crept in. Shadow's ears perked up at the sound of rustling leaves, his keen senses alert to the nighttime activities of the forest creatures beyond their yard. He stood, his tail swishing gently as he gazed toward the woods. Felix watched him, a familiar question surfacing in his mind. Did Shadow ever long for that other life? The one he might have had if fate hadn't intervened on that rainy night. The wild still called sometimes. Felix could see it in the way Shadow watched the forest and how he responded to the night sounds. But before the thought could fully form, Shadow turned back to him. The fox pressed his forehead against Felix's arm in that peculiar way of his, a gesture that was neither fully wild nor completely tame, but uniquely Shadow. Then he settled down again, curling into a tight ball beside Felix's chair. Felix smiled softly. Shadow was free to go if he chose. The story of the puppy that the firefighter rescued is more than just a tale of love and salvation. It's a journey full of surprises and unimaginable discoveries. From the first moments when the puppy shivered in the storm to the shocking truth being revealed, we've witnessed the conflicting emotions of the firefighter: confusion, fear, and eventually acceptance. This is a story no one could have predicted, and it serves as a reminder that sometimes what we think we understand may hide secrets beyond our comprehension. If you found this story intriguing, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and stay connected to our channel. We're always bringing you captivating, unexpected stories like this one, and you definitely won't want to miss out on the next one. Subscribe today so you won't miss any of the thrilling videos we have in store.